Hi, everyone, and welcome to Modern Learning on the Air. I'm your host, David Kelly, and today we bring you something a little different. We often bring in external voices as our guests on the podcast, but today we're going to be going internal. For more than 20 years, Jennifer Hofmann has helped organizations design and deliver live learning experiences at scale. And in this episode, we're going to explore what 2 decades of live learning have taught her about capacity, burnout, partnership, process, and the systems required to scale without sacrificing quality or humanity. If your team feels stretched but still needs to grow, this conversation will offer perspective and a path forward. Jennifer, thanks so much for being our guest today.
Hi, David.
Jennifer, you and I know each other very well, but for our listeners who may not be familiar with your work, tell us a little bit about your history with InSync.
Sure. In around 2000, I started InSync Training, and with the idea that people were implementing all these technologies, we were kind of starting into that .com era where everybody was investing in tons and tons of technology, but didn't know what to do with it. And the virtual classrooms, I was coming from an instructional design background, a face-to-face facilitation background, and what virtual classrooms were going to be the answer to everything, right? We were never going to have to go to the classroom again, but everybody was very focused on technology. And we started in sync with the idea of how to implement the technology well. And we've never been a technology company, but really a training quality company, how to facilitate well, how to design interactions that are really engaging and meet learning objectives and meet business objectives, and how to support the learner through that entire process. And through 25, 26 years now of InSync Training, we've been growing with the virtual classroom, hybrid learning, and classroom learning, really focused on how to make live learning great and impactful. I believe that all this technology can work, but I don't believe the technology is going to do the job for us.
Excellent. I love that. So, as you mentioned, you've been in this space of live learning for over 20 years, and you've seen a lot of changes, as I have over the course of that time. Is there, when you look back on 20 plus years of live learning, is there any lesson that you've learned in that period that has kind of surprised you?
Well, what amazes me is that people keep trying to make new technologies and new delivery methods look like something familiar. If we look at something like live theater, we don't pretend that live theater is the same as television or is the same as a motion picture, even though we've got actors and we've got directors and we've got content. We know that those are all different experiences. But when it comes to training, we have this impression that everything should look like face to face. Everything should look like an in-person experience. And so we try to force everything into that mode. Even though the tools are different, the abilities are different, interactions are different. We don't design for the tool that we have. We design for the experience that we wish we had.
So that's an interesting segue into the next question that I want to ask, because one of the things that in your work you've done very, very well is keeping that humanity and that live learning experience there. And as people try to scale their live learning efforts, there's a natural tendency to scale just through the lens of, well, we need more humans. It's a human experience. We need more humans. We're going to bring more facilitators in. And you've actually looked at scaling differently, that it's about more than just adding additional facilitators. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I am. But I want to add one thing to what you just said. Not only do we add more facilitators, but since the virtual classroom can have 100 people, let's add more learners too.
Sure.
Let's just force as many people in as we can, but try to make it look like the traditional classroom, even though you'd never put 200 people into a project management class face to face. You just wouldn't do it. What I think the pandemic made it really clear that you can't just scale learning by adding more people, by adding more facilitators. And that's when it really, really came home for people. So I think we were pretty resilient when the pandemic hit. So organizations shut down and virtual classrooms exploded. The technology companies didn't know what hit them. And so everybody's working from home, from their own devices, which were very different from the devices they were working at work. They've got different backgrounds. Their families are home. Their pets are home. And companies said, well, you can't do your job, so let's give you lots of training. And I think that was a good intention. So we had a lot of training that first 6 months. But what we did was we just kind of threw everything into Zoom and hoped that it stuck, right? We didn't teach our learners how to be really present and how to learn from this environment under all the stress they were under in the rest of their lives. We didn't teach our facilitators how to be successful. We didn't redesign our content. We took those slides, just like we used to dump them into e-learning, and we dumped them into the virtual classroom. We lectured for an hour and a half or 8.5 hours for 5 days in a row. And then we said the technology doesn't work. And I still run into people that are like, I loathe Zoom. I don't know how you can work in those environments. And what I want to say is it's not the tool, it's the fact that we didn't implement the tool well. When you are scaling, when you are trying to reach learners in different cultures, in different languages, in different time zones, with different experiences with technology, you really need to meet them more where they are and not focus on the technology, but focus on them. So don't talk to your Zoom screen or your WebEx screen. Talk to the people that are listening to you and ask for help, ask the learners to help, bring in those producers or those second set of hands, do whatever you can, but don't just think that I've got the capacity to teach 1,000 classes in a week. Just because you have the capacity doesn't mean you have the skill set or the ability or that you're not going to really burn out your staff.
Yeah, and one of the things that I think about as I'm listening to you is centered on that word capacity. I can't tell you how many times I've had conversations with learning teams where they're telling me the story of this major project that they had and telling me how successful it was. And I'm listening to them like, you sound exhausted. And they're like, well, yeah, because we were doing sessions at 8 a.m. because we got this global audience. We're doing it at 8 a.m. and 10 p.m. and blah, blah. Man, why didn't you ask for help? Like that's a lot. Why do you think that so many L&D teams fall into this trap of feeling like they have to do everything on their own?
I think there's a couple of things feeding into this. One is we really don't feel like we've got a lot of other options. We've got a team of 12. We've got to do it with a team of 12. And because L&D has unfortunately often been looked at as almost an overhead expense for an
Mhm.
organization, it's not profit generating for most organizations. It's hard to increase budget, increase headcount, and it's especially hard to do it quickly because learning and development also implies a certain amount of subject matter expertise. Whether you're designing content or delivering content, you can't just create that expertise overnight. You have to grow it either in your organization or bring it in. So I think that's one problem. We don't know. One problem is that we don't realize we have another option. I think another problem is that you've been to a lot of L&D conferences, used to run a lot of L&D conferences, and there's tons and tons of vendors there. And I think what happens is that we as professionals go and there's AI and there's chatbots and there's virtual reality and there's e-learning and there's LMS. And people not in learning and development assume, well, you're a trainer, you should know how to implement an LMS. You're a trainer, you should go to the conference, go to a 1 hour speech, no matter how good it is, and come back and implement a chat bot for our HR program. I'm sure you've seen a lot of that, David. And I think that we say we take it on as an industry. We're like, okay, we're in training. We should understand AI. We should understand chatbots. We should understand how to implement all the new e-learning tools. And what I really wish we could do is allow our professionals to specialize and develop as professionals in particular areas and to create teams around those specialties instead of training people to be an inch or two deep in 12 different things. So no matter how hard they try, and I think L&D people are some of the hardest working people in the world, no matter how hard they try, they can't be expert at all of that. But they really try and they're afraid to say, I can't do this. And they're afraid to wave that white flag.
Yeah, there's an element here when you were talking about that conference experience. And I've seen this, I've felt this, if I'm honest, when you walk around that expo and you're walking around and you're seeing all these different things, there's kind of that shiny object syndrome of just, oh, look at this, I want to touch this, I want to do this. Where does that factor into it? Like, how do we control for that aspect of it? Because you're right, it is distracting to have all of these different things in without having the skill set to use them.
My original life was an instructional designer. And I believe that we should start with our designs being as simple as possible. If a telephone call will work And now that's a little outdated, but I used to say if you could pick up the phone and train somebody to do it on the phone, why are you bringing them together or why are you bringing them into the virtual classroom? Find the simplest way to deliver something. But we are so attracted by the phones and the alerts and the instant feedback, that instant gratification, that we think that we create our content around that as well. Okay, this is the latest thing. If I don't jump on that bandwagon, I'm going to fall behind. But I think most of our learners would love to just be in a fantastic, live, old fashioned interaction where they're learning from each other and participating in well written case studies without having to worry about, do I have to learn another piece of technology to be successful in this? Because every time we add another layer of technology, I think we're putting a burden on our students as well, aren't we? They have to learn how to use the technology. They have to decide on their own how deeply to engage, how much do they need to learn. And then next week it's going to be just the next big thing.
Actually, I want to jump on part of what you said there, because when I think about how this nature to be heroic, this nature to step in and just get it done as a trainer, you mentioned the fact that you started in this field as an instructional designer, and I think about that role when I started as compared to where it is today. When there are probably when I started in this field, there were probably four different job descriptions that aren't on the average team today that were on my team in the past that are down now just bullet points on the instructional designer's job description.
Right.
There's so much additional stuff. When I had an instructional designer, that's what they did. They designed instructional material, and we had developers and we had other people. And that was always a challenge for us to do that. And I think that adds to it. But what we don't often pay attention to when we're adding all of these bullet points to the job descriptions, and we're adding more sessions to the calendar just so we can meet the goals, is that there's a cost to that. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on what is the cost, whether it's operational, emotional, or something else. What is the cost that happens with teams and with organizations when we try to scale simply through human heroics?
Well, there's obviously this idea of burnout where I just can't do one more thing, but I don't even think at the individual level that's really important. But at the organizational level, I think if there's a high risk of failure or for our programs just not meeting the mark and not meeting the business objective. And because let's face it, anytime something goes wrong in a company, it's almost always training's fault. Either the training wasn't there in time, there was no training, it wasn't good, it was too late. There's a lot of different aspects of it. And if we keep trying to do so much and not deliver great training that meets business objectives, I think we run a real risk of becoming irrelevant, especially now with AI doing seemingly being able to do everything. And there is a role for that. But a lot of our colleagues are getting worried. Like, what does this mean to my job? If AI can create this training? But wouldn't it be great right now is if AI is there creating the so-called easier stuff, maybe we have time. Maybe we have time to create great training experiences that we didn't have time for before. That in-depth leadership training that's really on point for your organization, or product sales training with role plays and that real conflicts that people can work through, or new hire orientation that's more than how to use your computer or how to log in, but how to interact and how to be part of the culture. Right now, our biggest restriction is time for development, time to maintain that content, and time to get it out there. But if the easy stuff can be automated, isn't that a great opportunity for us to actually become more and more relevant and part of the organization?
It absolutely is. And I totally agree with you. Time is probably the most difficult resource. I think that's where the strain hits for us. I mean, when we talk about the heroics that trainers often use, the heroics, we tend to look at it through the lens of behavior, but the reality is, if you look at it a little bit more objectively, the heroics is kind of back to that point I made about the job description. How many hats are you wearing? Oh, I'm the instructional designer today, but I'll step in and I'll be the facilitator. And that's generally how a lot of organizations approach scale. And we're going to take a break, but when we come back, we're going to look at what changes when we change our point of view around scaling, where it's less about adding more effort and adding more humans to the equation, and more about examining the system and how that can change to make our scaling more effective. So stay with us. We'll be right back with that.
Do you have bench strength, or do you have one person holding the whole thing together? If one producer being out puts 3 sessions at risk, or one facilitator swap derails a cohort, then your model is fragile. And fragility shows up as drift, before it shows up as a disaster. Your prep windows shrink. Handoffs, they get a little sloppy. Standards vary by cohort. Your learners, they can feel that inconsistency. Your team will patch it together with extra hours and then call it scale. 41% of L&D teams feel maxed out with zero backup. The fix is not by asking people to push harder. The fix is a delivery system. Clear roles across facilitation, production, and design support. One playbook, quality checks, real redundancy. That is why we created the Managed Services Blueprint. It gives you a practical way to diagnose your delivery model. It helps you spot breakpoints, name your non-negotiables, and map the coverage, standards, and visibility you need to scale without the new headcount. So download the blueprint. The link is right there in the description.
Welcome back. For our next segment, we're going to change our perspective here. And instead of talking about how humans scale, we're going to look at the systems that support our ability to scale live learning. Jennifer, when we start talking about scale, at what point in your career did you start to realize that scale really required a system to support it properly, not just great facilitators?
In order to scale, we don't just need people. We need a way to make sure that people are ready to teach online. We need to make sure the learners are open to learning online and they believe that it's worth their time. If it's just hour after hour of webinar type format where they don't interact, then they're not going to be engaged. So we need to create a set of rules and guidelines to make sure our content is engaging. And in Sync, we try to make sure it's engaging on an emotional level so people react well, on an environmental level where that their environment is conducive to them training, whether it's accessibility or whether their facilitator is able to speak in their language or whether somebody's there for them for technical help, as well as intellectual engagement. So does it adopt to adult learning theory? Is it important to my work? Do I see the relevance of it? So you need systems in place to design strong training, to support strong training, and to deliver strong training to the point where if we're delivering 1,000 sessions in a month globally, we know that every step along the way, the processes are in place. You need consistency. It's about creating a structure that makes quality repeatable, but not just repeatable, but also relevant in the different situations. If we're teaching in the United States versus Japan, for example, we might need to make adjustments. The message is still the same, but culturally, we might need to adjust the content. Or if it's virtual and we've got 6 different cultures involved, how do we adapt to that?
Mm-hmm.
So you can't just have, if you're just going to have one set of content and deliver it exactly the same way, then it might as well be an e-learning that is repeatable.
Mm-hmm.
So you need process to quality. You need to train people. We're very bad at training ourselves, aren't we? We're
Yeah, one of the
like
big.
the carpenter's kid has no shoes. We don't
Mm-hmm.
train people how to design for great interactions. We don't train people how to deliver virtually. And I think that makes a big difference.
Well, and when we start talking about the systems, I know when you were talking about the standardizations that InSync puts in place, a system starts with having a framework. We always need to be adaptable to the different context of each group that we're dealing with, but it starts with a solid framework. And InSync's done work in that area. Can you tell us a little bit about the framework that you use? You talked about the emotional and the different characteristics we look for. Tell us a little bit about that.
So we call it our Inquire engagement framework. It's based on the idea that we can't just engage people intellectually, which is where we start as designers. We want to make sure people learn the content and are able to apply the content. But intellectual engagement can be great, but if people don't care about it, or if people are learning in an environment which doesn't work for them, or if there's a cultural problem or even a technical problem, it can really impact the learning. So we need to make sure all 3 types of engagement are included. For emotional engagement, we're talking about psychological safety. We're talking about making sure people that are coming in that are speaking different languages maybe have some support in the chat. Maybe if we've got some native Chinese speakers, and we're teaching in English, maybe we've got a producer that also that speaks both languages that can support them. That gives them an emotional safety net. So they say, okay, I'm safe here. They want to support me. I can get the help that I need. We need to have environmental engagement, which doesn't just mean my computer works, but it means I'm learning from a place where they allow me to learn. For example, how many times in the history of the virtual classroom somebody's learning at a very important class, very important point, and their boss comes and taps them on the shoulder or sends a text and says, "Listen, can you come and help me right now?" And I get up and I go away. That environment is not conducive to instruction. It makes the instruction look not important. So we need to engage people on multiple levels, and we can do that with technology. A lot of people still they loathe the virtual classroom. If I was face to face, I would know if you were paying attention. And I'm here to tell you that's not true. We at 7 years old can pretend to the teacher that we're paying attention. We know how to nod. We know we learned that very early. We can
Hmm.
pretend to take notes. And so we need to rely on more than just our eyes and body language. And now we have all these tools that can help us do it, but we need to design courses that allow us. An hour lecture is not going to emotionally engage anybody.
Yeah. And I'm thinking back to when I was internal, working for training director different banks, and in full honesty, when I think about when I would scale our live and virtual efforts, I had my core team when we would do our virtual sessions all the time. But when we needed to scale, we started bringing in, for lack of a better term, the B team, and occasionally the C team. Oh, you're free on the schedule. We're gonna have you facilitate a session. And the reality is, I don't necessarily think that the people who had the people who had the C team did not have the same experience as the people who had the A team. And that's where I think that I talk about the system and the process. How does having a system in place as it relates to working with an operational partner like InSync protect the quality as the volume increases?
It's internal or with a partner. The people
Hmm.
that you have responsible for delivering your content need to be qualified to deliver in the format in which they're engaged. They need to have content expertise, and they also need, to lesser or greater extents, a certain amount of operational support because it's a different environment. Like we started out, it's a different environment than face to face. So, an operational partnership, when you're working with a vendor like InSync or any other vendor out there, you need to make sure that there are quality gates in place, that they're certified to teach in the environment which they're teaching. And they also have a certain amount of content expertise. And also, those systems should have things like auditions, maybe the ability for you to check out the facilitators to make sure that they match your corporate culture, the ability to train them to sign off that they can teach your content on your behalf. We know that we've done a good job when our students say, "Oh, you don't work for XYZ company? We thought you were one of us,"
Hmm.
because your partner should, in the process, be qualified to teach, be qualified to teach your content, know how to use the technology that your organization is using, know how to get the support they need within your LMS, and be open to that. So they become so integrated, when you don't know that they're not part of XYZ company. They become part of your company. They're not waving their own flag, they're waving your flag. Does that make
Yeah,
sense?
it does. And I love the distinction between an operational partnership and outsourcing because I think a lot of people come to this sort of scaling situation with we need to find an outsourcing partner. It's kind of the term that our industry has settled on. But an operational partnership is different for all of the reasons that you mentioned, for all of the benefits, and in addition to all the benefits it provides to the learners, it's going to provide more impactful programs, which I think is great. And I think for the closing set question I want to ask, and before we go to our next break, there even that difference between operational partnership and outsourcing speaks to the misconceptions that can exist in our field around this. And I think you've had the experience of talking with learning leaders all around the world in your career around the topic of how we can enhance virtual and live learning. What are some misconceptions that you've encountered that people still have about bringing in external support as an operational partner?
couple of things. The first is that external support means losing control. You're going to maybe losing control of the quality of the delivery of the program. Maybe the content will skew. Or maybe your culture, your corporate culture isn't represented in the delivery of the content, because corporate culture still means a lot. Maybe it even means more as our corporations become more dispersed. Make corporate culture even has a bigger role because we want to make sure that connection is there. So I think that's one big misconception. But if you've got a good partner, that doesn't have to be the case. There needs to be onboarding. You're not going to be able to take David Kelly today and have them teach at XYZ company tomorrow, even if they have the content expertise. There needs to be an onboarding process to initiate them into the corporate culture. And then your teams of facilitators and producers, if you're using them, needs to share what they've learned with each other. So if David teaches one day and Jennifer teaches the next, we have the benefit of each other's experience, and we're building and integrating ourselves with the culture. So that's the first thing. I think that you don't need to lose control and you don't need to lose quality or culture. But there's also a belief that costs go up because you're outsourcing or turning it over, because your costs are built in. You know what your budget is. And when you hire someone else to do the work for you, that's obviously another line item. But I think that if you've got consistent and quality external support that you really trust, it's really a partnership. I think you can actually stabilize quality and you can be more predictable in your budgeting. If you have to hire and maintain staff all year round for particular topics or for surges, that can get very expensive. And then if they're assigned to something else when you need them for a different project, then they're not available. So you might be able to reduce costs or at least cage costs and know exactly what you're paying for. So I don't think outsourcing or using a partner has to be more expensive, has to lose quality. It's just we might need to frame it in a different way.
And in all the questions that we've explored so far, there's a word that keeps coming to my head that's kind of this overarching theme that I'd like to target in our next segment, which is around making scaling something that is sustainable. Heroics can help you with the peaks and valleys occasionally, but if you're just going to be in a period of continued growth and your needs are scaling and not necessarily in a peaks and valleys, and they're just scaling up, whatever your scaling or strategy needs to be, it needs to be sustainable. And I want to talk a little bit about that in our next segment. So when we come back from our final segment, we're going to talk a little bit more about what sustainable scale actually looks like in practice and how to know when it's time to rethink your model. Stay with us.
Quick question. Do you actually know your L&D team's capacity? Most teams don't. They just feel the pressure. The capacity scorecard fixes that. 12 questions, 3 minutes, and boom, instant clarity on where your team's strong and where the risks really are. If you're running learning programs, don't guess your capacity. Measure it. Take the scorecard and see your results. Tap the link below and start now. It's fast, it's easy, and honestly, you'll be glad you did.
Welcome back. And for our closing segment, I want to talk a little bit about sustainability as we scale. To recognize that quality and humanity don't have to suffer just because we're scaling our programs. And we want to talk about how we can scale our programs with process improvement. And when I think about the work that you and the team have done, Jennifer, at this stage in my career, I'm fascinated by the language that we use, because I think the language that we use often shapes the way that we think. And there's a phrase that I've heard a number of team members use that I want to get your take on. It's this phrase, scale without compromise. What does that phrase actually mean to you?
Well, when I first started a business and I was basically an independent contractor hiring other independent contractors to try and get us to grow, I was given some business advice that if I took on a $25,000 job and I had to get it done, I could work like crazy and get it done and not sleep in 4 days. I could get it done. But if that job was $200,000, I wouldn't be able to get it done in a weekend without having the right support around me, the right people around me to help. And I would have to compromise something. I'd have to give something up, and the project would not meet my standards or the client expectations. So $25,000, I could have been a hero. At $200,000, I would have sunk the ship because I couldn't have done it by myself. Scaling without compromise kind of means moving quickly, getting something done, but don't become careless about it. So, yes, we often need to roll out a lot of content fast, and that means delivering it quickly when we're talking about live content. But it can't come at the expense of learner engagement or business impact. And that's where an internal team and a good external partner can really work together. So we don't rely entirely on the internal team for X and the external team for Y, but the responsibility crosses over. We're working together. So, for example, at InSync, if there's a hurricane coming through Georgia, we send out a note to our facilitator and producer teams saying, if anybody's in this area, let us know and let's assign backup. We do that ahead of time. But we also will go to our clients because we don't know where their students are and say, this is an option for your students if they get caught without power or they can't attend because of the hurricane. So you can scale if you've got that process in there. You can scale if you really can rely on the people of your team to cover when things go wrong. Back when we started the company, we got our first overnight client. The first time we were delivering programs at 2:00 in the morning. And I would wake up, and this is back in maybe 2005, and I would log on to make sure my team was logging on and to make sure that they were there supporting it. But now I don't even think about it. And that's a system that's a system that's sustainable, but it takes a lot of trust. And that's what we need to offer to our clients every single time. They need to know that every one of their sessions is the most important session that we're working on at that day. Every one of them.
I love that. And I think about my own experience, and in fairness of the experience that I've seen from a lot of organizations as they scale. I don't know exactly. Well, I guess it's just resources, but that is a lot dictate. But I've noticed that as the scaling gets in, there starts to be a shift of when we don't need, when we have all the time and resources available, we're fully engaged. We're doing everything that we can to deliver the vision of what that session is. But as we scale and the calendar gets busy and we start bringing in other facilitators, that vision starts to get diluted and it starts to be less idealistic and more, we start just pushing content to people to a certain extent as the scaling gets up. And there's a certain loss of the human element. You've talked so much about the connection that exists through live learning. And if we're just delivering content through this technology, we're losing that. How do we maintain that human element when we're delivering hundreds of sessions across our account?
So some of this is mindset. Some of this is big picture that every single session we deliver has to be important as every other session we deliver. I know that's easy to say, but for the learners, this is the only time they're getting this content. And if it's going to be impactful for each individual learner, we need to treat each session as important as every other session we teach. We have to remember the technology can't do the job for us. And especially with virtual classrooms, we assume that the virtual classroom is going to do the engagement, but we need to remember we're not there to talk to Zoom or WebEx. We're there to talk to the learners. We can scale, but once the scaling stops losing its humanity, if you can watch a recording and have the same experience as going there live, then why did you expect everybody to go there live in the first place? Why couldn't they have watched the recording? And that's always been kind of my bar. What are you offering, David, that people wouldn't get if they'd watched the recording? And I think that's the big difference between, say, a webinar and training. I'm not saying a webinar isn't important. Obviously, people think they're important and valuable. They keep going. We keep delivering them. There's value there. But I wouldn't call it training because people aren't interacting. Even conference sessions, sometimes they're training, but generally they're much more of a lecture type of approach. To be training, we need to do something different, be able to behave differently, have something we can apply back on the job as a result of that interaction. And that's the way to keep it human. Remember that there are learners on the other side. And also, I think we as individuals need to say, would I wanted to sit through that session? Would that have engaged me? And that goes to the not just selection of your staff, but the training of your staff. Keep reiterating in their mindset, Make them watch their own recordings. Would you have sat through that program? Now, there was one time when we had a client come in, it was right before the pandemic, and they had lost their vendor. And they had a worldwide program going on in something like 8 different languages, where the
Wow.
same session was maybe 4 different sessions, but something like 720 sessions in a 2-week period, 2 hours each. Now, the 4 different topics being taught. And we had 2.5 weeks to scale for that. Now, the 2.5 weeks were crazy busy. We needed facilitators, we needed producers, we needed multiple languages, and we needed to organize it with their schedule on the other side. Just getting the scheduling side of that was tremendous. We pulled it off. We didn't miss a session. And we probably didn't split the atom in any of that training, but it was a 2-hour training session. But it went off without a hitch, or relatively without a hitch, 24 hours a day in 7 different languages. But that's what having a staff you can rely on does for you. We can surge. And once you say, yes, I can do this, you're there to do it. All hands on deck, but you get it done.
Yeah. So I want to touch on two elements of what you discussed there. First off, I love the positioning that you had where you were taking the technology and putting it in the background, because we shouldn't lead with the tool. The tool is not the solution. The humans that you're dealing with are the solution. And when tech goes in the background, it gives us the opportunity to focus on the human elements and the human connection that's there. And I love that aspect. I want to flip the human paradigm for a second, because one of the things that's been in this discussion, but we haven't called it out directly, we talk about the humanity, and usually in all the discussions, including one we've been having here, is the focus on the humanity from the learner's perspective. And that's important. I don't want to minimize that in any way. But one of the things that's been part of this conversation without being called out directly is your focus on the humanity on your team,
Mhm.
on the scalability that's there. And that's one of the things I think we often overlook in our rush to be the heroes and our rush to just step up and do things. We lose out on the humanity that we focus to our team sometimes. And I think that that's where we can how do you maintain that, and what benefit does that serve for the clients that you're working with?
First, it comes, how do we maintain it? We have to establish it first. We have to establish that you can be successful in virtual environments, that you can connect in a different way, but maybe just as effectively in virtual environments. But we have to develop that mindset and train our team to not just believe that that can happen, but believe that they can make it happen. So some of that is in partnerships. One of the reasons that we've always been a big believer in having a producer is just not to make sure the cameras are always working, but to make sure that there's somebody there to catch the facilitator or to point things out to the facilitator. I haven't heard from David in 22 minutes. Maybe it's about time you call on him. That stuff is going on in the background, and it reminds us to be human, because we all get stuck in this. I'm talking to the slides. I'm talking to the slides. I don't necessarily see everybody. So I forget I'm talking to people. That second set of hands really boosts us up and helps us to be more successful, and also keeps us from being burnt out. When I do webinars, the most frustrating thing about webinars for me is I'm not getting this back and forth interaction. And so therefore it's exhausting. I think it's exhausting to teach this way well, because we're creating so much of our own energy. And we have to acknowledge that. So having facilitators teach 6 and 8 hour sessions, it's just as exhausting for them as it is for the learners to sit there. So I don't even know if I'm on your original question anymore, David.
They are.
But,
That's
but
good.
it's hard to. I can sit down and choose to watch a television show in my spare time, and it's a show I want to watch. And the next day, I don't know what it was on it. I couldn't tell you the story, even though it was motivated to be there and it was on my choice. Once we start putting people through these very passive experiences, it's exhausting for the people delivering the experiences. It's exhausting for the learners. And I think that starts to build. Well, the last time I taught this, it was sucked. So it's going to suck again this time. And we kind of become victims of our own not success, so to speak. So we need to not overburden our facilitators if we can help it. We can all get through a surge. We all made it through COVID, right? I mean, we can be heroes if we have to be, but to expect that heroic action all the time, every time, is something that's really going to not just burn out your facilitator team, but it's going to affect the impact of your training. And people are going to say, well, that virtual classroom didn't work for that. When really maybe we didn't design it well, or we weren't delivering it well, or we shoved too many people into the same virtual classroom at the same time, so we couldn't connect with everybody. We have to remember that this is about people. If we don't want to make it about people, then use the technology to deliver the same training in the background and have them do it at their own time, because they're going to have maybe a more comfortable experience.
So we've discussed a lot of aspects of how we scale our live learning. I'd love to close by bringing it down to like, what does this look like? What does this look like on a day-to-day basis? And you've had wonderful projects in your career. Can you share a story of one of the things that you've done where kind of give us the before and after? Like, where did things start? What were the problems that were being addressed? What was put in place? And how did that impact the organization?
So we've got a longtime client we've been working with. It's probably 20 years, almost 20 years now. And they're a global hardware technology company, networking company. And one of our projects for them right now is we deliver their virtual new hire onboarding globally, which is it's a great project for us. And it's very interesting. Some of the concerns about that, we talked about concerns earlier, is how can you teach our onboarding? Well, there's a culture impact there. You're not even on site half the time. Sometimes we teach it face to face, sometimes we teach it virtually. But the problem that they were having is that they were rolling out onboarding all around the world and all of their different field offices in all their different countries. And some of the field offices were developing their own onboarding. Some of them were taking the onboarding that was given to them by so-called corporate and adjusting it, or saying, well, I know it's a day, but we'll get it done in 2.5 hours, or they just kept making adjustments. So we weren't getting a consistent experience. And that had an impact on employee engagement, especially new hire employee engagement. And if you lose them early, it's very hard to get those employees back and get them interested again. The best way to keep an employee is to make them feel important for that first 30, 60, 90 days. So we worked with the company to develop a 30, 60, 90-day onboarding program. The development, to be fair, was mostly theirs, but how do they implement it in a consistent way around the world? And so what we've been doing is, part of it is, how do we get your technology to work? Part of it is, what's the corporate culture here? Some of it is how to interact with your supervisor and where to go for help. All the stuff that's important, but we were able to deliver a very consistent, and we're continuing to deliver a very consistent experience to the global audience at this organization. Now, what they have the opportunity to do, and many of them are doing it at the local areas, is there's some stuff that is very specific to maybe Japan, or
Hmm.
there are laws that are specific to the United States that might not apply other places. So there's also some guidance about how to create some customized modules that they can deliver on site. But that guidance is also given a lot influenced by our facilitators, who take the questions that are coming in. They, well, that really doesn't apply to us, or how do we, or the laws are different in this country, or we don't have those same days off because our holidays are different. And the facilitators bring that back and feed it back into the development team, so they can improve those experiences and figure out what needs to be customized culture to culture and field office to field office. And that's what a partnership is really all about. It's not just about the vendor shining because we're doing a great job. It's about the learners being successful and the long-term business goals of lower turnover, higher employee engagement, faster time to mastery on the job. Those things are really critical for an organization to remain competitive, especially now. So that's what a strong partnership can help you do. It can be consistent delivery. You can surge because you're not depending on your own people that might be doing other things. If you're hiring 100 extra people this month, you can figure out a way to get it delivered because you've got that partner there to help you. And sometimes you can do it all on your own. And training and development people, learning and development people, like I said, they're hardworking and they're really smart and they want to learn. That's why they're in this industry. I really, really believe it. But they don't need to do it all. And we'd like to help.
Yeah. And I think that story, which is the business impact attached to that story, shows how working with an operational partner can help. So I really appreciate you sharing that. I appreciate you sharing all of your insights from everything that you've learned at InSync and throughout your career with us here today.
Well, thank you, David.
And to our listeners, if today's conversation resonated, I encourage you to download the Managed Services Blueprint, How to Scale Without Headcount. This is a guide that breaks down how operational partnerships work, from scheduling to the global rollout, and it shows how scale can feel calm, not chaotic. You can also check out the recording of our February online discussion, Scaling Live Learning. This is an executive roundtable discussion exploring managed learning services models and the benefits they provide to organizations. A link to the recording is in our show notes. And as always, subscribe to Modern Learning on the Air for more conversations about learning, leadership, and performance in the modern workplace. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you for tuning into Modern Learning on the Air. For all your training and services needs, visit us at insynctraining.com. And don't forget to sign up for our monthly webinars, where we cover key topics and trends in the learning and development space. Until next time, keep learning and keep growing.